All right, everybody, welcome back to the Big Tire Garage for another one of our question and answer sessions here. You know the drill. You ask the question, I give you the answer. If I pick your question, you get a sticker pack sent to you in the mail. The good news is sticker packs now include the new shop truck sticker. So you're going to get the shop truck, bad old wagon, lockjaw, and the OG Big Tire Garage logo. Now, we're also working on a couple of new things. We're working on 2 new stickers and some patches. Now, the good news is all those stickers are now for sale on our Shopify store. So if you don't want to run the risk of trying to get one of your questions answered here and you want a sticker pack, I'll put a link in the description below and you can go ahead and jump on there and buy your stickers. So here we go. Let's jump right into it. So today's questions, once again, same as always, 3 questions and then a where is it now part of the discussion. So I'm going to save this one for later. Start from the top. First question. First question is from Zachariah Holman 7046. Got a question for you. This relates to drive shafts. So my Jeep right now has stock size U-joints, front and rear, but they're aftermarket Adams drive shafts. How do you decide what size U-joints to have and what size is too small? Is it a bad idea to have a U-joint be a fuse in the system and carry a spare drive shaft rather than break something like an axle, transfer case, etc.? Okay, so I'm going to assume that if you have Adams drive shafts in your Jeep, he doesn't say what model of Jeep it is. So I'm going to assume that since he says stock size U-joints, he's probably running a TJ, which means he's probably got a fairly small U-joint, like a 1310. And the question he wants to know is, when do you upgrade to the larger U-joint? So U-joints are available in multiple sizes. Some of the most popular ones that we use in off-road are 1310, that's pretty standard factory size U-joint. You got a 1330, which you sometimes see in the 1-ton Ford stuff if you just pull it straight out of the junkyard. 1350, which is kind of like the first sort of like upgraded U-joint, so a 1350. And then you have 1410s, 1480s, and now you'll even see some guys running 1550s. Question is, when do you decide what size U-joint to run? Well, probably the most popular upgraded U-joint size is going to be 1350. Now, the reason that the 1350 is so popular is you can get aftermarket yokes for almost any axle in that 1350 size, and those yokes will actually be upgraded. So you can get a forged yoke with a 1350 joint fairly easy for almost everything from a Dana 44 all the way up to a Dana 80. When you get into the bigger U-joint stuff, the 1410s, 1480s, 1550s, really honestly, that's until you're breaking 1350s on a regular basis, you don't necessarily need to have those bigger joints. The other issue when you get into those really large joints, sometimes if you're running an axle that has a pinion guard, like a Ford 9-inch or a 14-bolt, a lot of those pinion guards that are sold from aftermarket companies, they were all originally designed around that 1350 joint. And the difference between, I should say this, I should have said this at the beginning, I apologize. The difference between 1310, 1330, 1350, 1410, 1480, and the 1550 is all size. So what happens is the 1310 is fairly small. 1330, the cross gets a little bit bigger, but the caps don't get bigger. 1350, everything gets bigger, caps get bigger, cross gets bigger. 1410, the cross gets bigger, but the caps stay the same as the 1350. You get the idea. Bigger, better, stronger. So the problem is, as I was talking about before, when you're talking about a 1350 versus a 1410 versus a 1480 versus a 1550, when you start to use those size U-joints in axles that have a pinion guard, what can happen is the actual pinion guard can deflect a little bit if you get into serious rocks. So what'll happen is you hit the pinion guard and it just moves a tiny little bit. Sometimes when you're running those super large U-joints like 1410s and 1480s, you'll actually end up doing damage to the U-joint with the pinion guard because the tolerances are so tight. So where does that lead us? That leads us to answer his question, when do you decide what U-joint? I would say pretty much everything that I build, I do 1350s, unless I'm going full race car stuff, then I might go 1410. I've really never felt the need to go any higher than 1410 unless I was building something with incredibly high horsepower. Then I would start looking into some bigger stuff. But honestly, 1410, 1350, it's kind of the sweet spot, to be honest with you. Is it a bad idea to have a drive shaft act as a fuse? Now, what he's referring to there is basically keeping the U-joint size smaller so that if something's going to break, it's going to be that U-joint versus something like a ring gear or a transfer case. And is that a bad idea? Not necessarily. I mean, you could do that. You just have to make that decision yourself. Do you want that to be the fuse? Do you want to have to change a drive shaft on the trail? Is it a big deal to you to have to do that? If it isn't, then fine. You can get away with just keeping those U-joints small, getting a spare shaft. Here is one piece of advice for you though. Don't just carry a spare shaft. You should also carry a spare shaft. You should carry a couple spare U-joints, and you should also carry a spare pinion yoke. And then if you have a specific yoke at your transfer case, you should carry a spare one of those, because quite often what happens is when those drive shafts fail, they usually damage either the pinion yoke or the transfer case yoke. That is easily done. So you necessarily don't just want to carry the drive shaft, because when the drive shaft breaks, if it breaks the little ear off the pinion yoke, then when you put the new drive shaft in, drive shaft isn't going to stay. So there you go. That's my opinion on that. 1350, 1410, and no, it's not a big deal. Carry a spare drive shaft. Thanks for your question. Don't forget, send me your mailing address. I'll get you a sticker pack out in the mail. So next question comes from Daily Driven, 9915. I have a question for your Q&A. How could a guy with experience become a, quote, behind-the-scenes helper on four-wheeler or a similar show, like Lucky Costa was on Hot Rod Garage and Overhauling? Love your show and your YouTube. That is a really good question. I get asked all the time by people like, how do I get a job on TV? How do I get a job being a host of a TV show? And I mean, those jobs are few and far between, let's be honest with yourself. That's not really something that just pops into your lap every day of the week. But to answer his question, behind the scenes mechanics. So most TV shows out there in the automotive genre will have a team of people who will come in and do the work when the camera crew is not filming. And the reason they do that is simply because of speed. So if you think of Overhauling, they were trying to get those cars built in, 7 days, 7 to 10 days is pretty much what they were averaging. And they needed a crew of people to come in and do the building when the camera crew wasn't filming with the hosts. The hosts of the time, Courtney Hanson, Chris Jacobs, Chip Foose. Those were technically the hosts of the shows. Guys like Lucky Costa, Ian Van Soyk, I think Brian Fuller was even on there for a little while. Those were basically considered build team guys. Now those build team guys, most of them usually end up landing on a TV show at some point in time. So the honest answer as to how do you get a job like that, it's honestly right place, right time. It's usually just luck of the draw. So what usually happens is, the production company's making a television show, and they're like, oh, we need some behind the scenes mechanics, or some guys going to do some work. And a bunch of people will show up, and they'll do the work on the show. And then if they have, good personality and they're good on camera, usually what happens, the producer will spot that and say, hey, that guy's good on camera. He can deliver lines. He can explain what he's doing. Let's pull him aside for a couple interviews. And then they'll remember that. And then in the future, if they're casting a show, then boom, that's where you land. So I guess my suggestion would be, first of all, number one, just be ready for that phone call. If you're ever in an area where they're filming a show and they call you up and they say, hey, we need some behind the scenes guys. I will say this, the behind the scenes stuff, it's hard work, it's long hours, and usually the chances of transitioning from a behind the scenes person to an on-air camera person, it's not a guarantee, and it's certainly not part of the package. Like, they don't hire you saying, we might put you on TV. Like, they're hiring you because they want you to be a mechanic or some type of worker behind the scenes. I think that the most important thing, if you do get an opportunity like that, would be to just say, hey, yeah, I'm willing to work long hours, I'll work overnight, and then the most important thing is, if you say the car will be done tomorrow, the car has to be done tomorrow. That's what they look for the most in that type of person. So if they're looking for a behind the scenes person and they're saying, hey, we need this engine in this vehicle running tomorrow, and you say, I can do that, you kind of get like one strike and you're out in that world. So if you say, yep, it'll be in that car running tomorrow, and tomorrow shows up and it's not running, that's pretty much, they're not going to ask you again to be that person, because they relied on you to have it done the next day. And the reality is they probably booked a crew and pulled film permits and all that kind of stuff. And then if the car isn't running, that's kind of like a, that's a big expense to them. They're not going to be too happy with that. So I would say, be open to the opportunity, be honest about your skill set, be honest about the deadlines that you can reach, and just work really, really, really hard. My shows, pretty much all of my shows that I've ever done, we've never had behind the scenes mechanics. That's always been kind of like my thing. I didn't want anybody else working on the cars. Myself, I quite enjoy working on the cars. So whenever it was offered to me to say, hey, we can bring in a bunch of people to build these vehicles for you, my answer was usually, no thank you, I would rather build them myself. Now in four-wheeler, we do have, I have a helper, we call him the shop minion, or the four-wheeler minion. We're going to talk about him in another question, I think on another video. Yeah, it's on a different video. You have to wait for that one. But that's a little bit different job for him, and I'll explain that when we talk about that. But I have never been a fan of behind-the-scenes mechanics. I have always said, if I'm going to go on TV and I'm going to say, I rebuilt this transmission, I need to be the person to rebuild that transmission. That's just how I've been my whole life, my whole career. It's built around that. Does it mean that I have to work a lot harder? Possibly. But at the end of the day, I really, really, really like building these vehicles. It's possibly one of my most favorite part of the job. So I don't really want to hand that off to anybody else. So I'm not judging anybody else who uses behind-the-scenes mechanics. I think lots of shows, probably the majority of the shows out there, do have some type of behind-the-scenes mechanic helping expedite production. It's the behind-the-scenes mechanic is not a knock on the person hosting the show. The reality is this: the most expensive part of making a television show is the crew. It's the film crew. It's incredibly expensive to have a camera guy, a sound guy, a lighting guy, probably a second camera guy, probably a grip, probably somebody like, you're talking about crews of 10, 15 people on some of these big productions, and you're paying them all per day, and you're paying them a lot of money. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to get a show shot in X amount of time, it's just good business as a production company to say, hey, you're going to work on this on TV, and then we're going to take you over here, and you're going to talk about something else while these 5, 6, 7 people come in and do some work on this car. That's just part of the business. I have always been fortunate in the fact that my shows didn't really, none of my shows have really had those like short-term deadline scenarios, and so I've never had to basically just break the rule and say, yeah, we'll do some behind-the-scenes mechanic. If I was ever put in that situation, I absolutely would. If it was unfeasible for me to get my stuff done to meet deadlines for the shows that I was hosting, then yes, I would say it's time to bring in some behind-the-scenes mechanics. Me personally, I just like working on cars. That's just how it works. So there you go. So I don't really think I answered your question. Honestly, it's really just luck of the draw, but when you do get that call, answer the phone and just work really, really hard and just prove your worth. Prove your worth to the production company, and that's what will get you on that short list of people to call. Next question is from Toyota Trail Buggy. What is your opinion on plug welding rod ends? I'm about to weld up 2-inch 250 wall links and would appreciate your recommendation. Okay, so plug welding rod ends. What he's referring to is pretty simple. When you put a tube insert into a piece of tubing to create basically a suspension link, there seems to be a lot of back and forth discussion on whether or not you should plug weld that rod end or just weld the edge of the rod end. My opinion is it really depends on the threaded insert that is going into the actual tube. So some threaded inserts have very, very thin wall where the threads are. And if you look at the threaded inserts and you see that it's incredibly thin, like some of them are under 1/8 of an inch if you factor in the valley of the thread cut. I feel that by plug welding that, there's a greater chance that you're actually going to deform the threads on that rod end. On a thicker tube adapter where there's a lot of beef there, then yes, plug welding. And by plug welding, what he means is basically you slide the tube insert into the tube. Before you do that, you're going to drill a hole into the tube. Then you're going to slide the insert in, and you're going to weld a plug weld, and then you're going to weld all the way around the tube. If you plug weld, you are going to have to ensure that you have a tap to recut those threads. Even on the thicker material, when you plug weld it, there's a very good chance that when you do that, you're going to deform the threads, and you're going to want to run a tap down. Don't just grab your rod end and spin it into the suspension link, because you're going to get it like 3/4 of the way in. It's going to hit that deformed section, and it's just going to start galling up the threads, and there's nothing you can do about it. So myself, when I weld rod ends in, I don't MIG weld them. I routinely will TIG weld them in, because what that gives me is the ability to really control that molten puddle with the TIG welder. So when I slide the tube insert into the tube, I can get my TIG welder, and what I can do is, most of the time, the rod end itself is beveled. That's step one. You want to bevel the tube really well to match that rod end. And then usually what I'll do is I'll do 2 passes around the rod end. So I do a root pass where I'm welding all the way around, and then I do a cover pass, all with the TIG welder. On any type of suspension that I haven't plug welded, I've never had a link failure without a plug weld. And I don't really think the plug weld is as essential in the joint if the actual butt weld joint is welded correctly. If you bevel it, prep it, clean it, weld it in multiple passes. I've never had a tube insert come out of a link in my career. And like I said, what I do is I look at that thread insert, and that's how I determine whether or not I'm going to plug weld it or not. The super thin ones, I'm just not comfortable doing it. Number one, I don't think it actually does anything to the joint, because on those super thin ones, there's no way you're going to be able to get enough heat into that thin material without completely destroying the tube insert. And then you're not even going to have threads to work with. So I don't think it actually does anything to that particular weld joint. On the thicker stuff where you can actually get some heat penetrated into the actual threads themselves, then yes, I feel that it actually does something in the system. Normally the thicker ones, you find those in steering, to be honest with you. And that's normally how I end up doing it. So the steering stuff, I'll usually end up welding, but the suspension stuff with the 1 1/4" rod ends, with the thread inserts that they give you, it's just super, super thin. Normally those, I do not plug weld at all. All right, so those are the 3 questions for this week. Once again, thank you so much for all of your questions. And now it's time for a Where Is It Now? Now, I made a note here to make sure that I actually don't redo the same truck. All right, so this week, Where Is It Now is the Bobbed Deuce. So, love that truck. Years ago, when I was hosting Extreme 4x4, I built a Bobbed Deuce. And what I ended up buying for the show was an actual fire truck, which was super cool. So I bought a 2.5 ton, so we call them Deuce and a half trucks, military truck, big 2.5 ton trucks with rock wheels front and rear. And then they usually have 2 axles in the back, basically both driven. So it's 6-wheel drive. I wanted a giant pickup truck, which was popular at the time. A lot of guys were building them. And so what I did is I basically built a Bobbed Deuce, which means you remove one of the rear axles, you adjust the wheelbase to what you want, and then in the case of that truck, we actually built our own bed. What a lot of guys would do is they take basically the military trailer that you often see pulled by those Deuce and a half trucks, and they basically drop that on as the pickup truck bed. I wanted my own bed, so we built our own bed from scratch, and I built it from scratch specifically because I built that truck to haul the Suzuki Samurai in the bed to the trail. And it actually worked really, really well. So it was a giant truck. It was kind of fun. We did some sort of like goofy, sort of like, I think it was black and silver camo on it. Paying homage to Stacy David's Sergeant Rock truck. I called it General Granite, which I thought was super cool. So we called it General Granite, painted it the black and silver, and then basically got it all set up. And it worked great. So where is it now? Well, it sat around the studios at the old production company for a while. We used it on a couple of trips. Problem was, just like everything else, wasn't that great of a truck to drive long distances. I think it like capped out at like 50 miles an hour. It smelled like diesel fuel. Whenever you drove it, you ended up with a pounding headache. So we only drove it down to the local off-road park a couple of times with the Zook to kind of show it off. It ended up being bought by a place in Cookeville, Tennessee that did rhino lining bed liner. And they just basically, I think they bed lined the bed and a couple other parts of it, and they parked it out front as like a big showpiece for their dealership. And that's the last I heard of it. I have no idea where it went after that. It really, really was a kind of a cool truck. You know, we put a half cab kit on it, did a big stack out the back. It was fun to drive. I did a 4-link in the back, and I put air ride on it, so the back would drop down a little bit, make it easier to load the Zook in, and then you could jack it up. So it didn't have leaf springs all the way around. It had a full 4-link on that Rockwell, which I thought was pretty cool. And that was a fun truck. So where is it now? No idea. If you know where it is, put it in the comments below, and I would love to know where that truck is. I did get an email or an instant message a few years ago that basically said, hey, the Bobbed Deuce is here, and I think it was for sale. Honestly, I don't want it. I got too many trucks, and once again, I would never use it. So, but it was a fun build for sure. So there you go, guys. Thank you so much for all of your questions this week. Once again, if you want to buy some stickers, I'll put the link in the description below, and keep those questions coming, and we'll keep these videos happening. We'll see you next time inside the Big Tire Garage.